Welcome back, true believers and spectacular Spidey fans, to another Spider-Man PS4 101 episode, and in this episode I'm going to break down all of the new information that we did get from Insomniac and Marvel at PlayStation Experience in regards to Marvel's Spider-Man. This goes for the main interview that I had with Brian Intar. This also goes for the podcast that Dan Slott and Christos Gage were a part of, as well as the new behind-the-scenes featurette that we did get from Insomniac and Marvel Games. But before I begin my video, everybody, please go over to fellow Spidey Squad member, the Mental Gamers YouTube channel, and go watch his video where he breaks down all of the new pieces of information that we did get at PSX. He did a great job analyzing it and discussing it, and the overall video is just fantastic, so go please support him and go check it out. And also go and check out fellow Spidey Squad member MCDC's channel, where he posted the full podcast that Dan Slott and Christos Gage were a part of, and you can listen to it on YouTube, and it's a great chat. I love listening to them talk about the game, and MCDC posted on his channel, so thank you for that, MCDC. You're awesome. So this new first piece of information that we did get at PSX is actually before PSX, which was at the Game Awards, and was actually when I first got to meet Brian Intar in person, and it was just so awesome meeting him for the first time, and we just talked about Spider-Man PS4 a little bit, and it was incredible talking to him about the game. But one interesting thing that he did bring up to me when we were talking about the game is that Peter looks a bit different from when we last saw him in the Paris trailer. And of course, Brian was telling me on how Insomniac have been continuously improving the game ever since we've seen it last at Paris, with the graphics, the swinging, the combat, all that great stuff. But then he talked about Peter, and he actually mentioned that how he looks a bit different from where we saw in Paris. And of course, what we know is that Peter Parker in the game is actually modeled off a real-life person named John that Insomniac have been using as a character model. And from what Brian has told me is that the next time we see Peter, he may look a bit different from when we last saw him. So who knows, that may just mean something new, like his hair might be cut, or maybe he might be wearing some different clothes, or maybe he looks a bit different overall. I have no idea, but I'm just really excited to see how Peter has changed since we last saw him in the Paris trailer. So the next piece of information about the game, everybody, is actually directly from PSX, but more specifically from the Marvel Flip Show. And of course, if you don't know, the Marvel Flip Show is the show that Marvel does where they talk about games, movies, comics, etc. And the one thing that they did is talk to Brian Intar and Bill Roseman about the Marvel Spider-Man booth that was at PSX, and Bill Roseman was describing everything that was around the booth, like the Iron Demon helicopter, the Spider-Man statue. But when he talked about this sign right here, he actually says something very interesting about this sign.
There's a Daily Bugle billboard up there. There's a sign for the J. Jonah Jameson Just the Facts podcast over there.
So apparently Just the Facts with J. Jonah Jameson is actually a podcast, and who knows, maybe in the game when you're swinging around the city, we might actually be able to listen to this podcast in-game where JJ is talking about the things that Spider-Man has done in the city. He might give some updates about certain crimes going around that Spider-Man might be blamed for because of JJ being classic JJ. I don't know, I just find it really interesting that JJ actually has a podcast in this game's universe, and who knows how far that can actually go in the game, whether that's a small Easter egg or actually something more. So this next piece of information comes from the Periscope that Marvel held at PSX, where Ryan Penagos was talking to Bill Roseman and Brian Intar about Spider-Man PS4, and then they started to bring up the traversal aspect of the game, which we all know by now is heavily based on momentum. However, Brian Intar started to discuss about the traversal aspect, and when you are swinging towards a building, you won't just splat towards the wall and then fall to the ground. You will actually just keep continuously building up your momentum, so which is what we saw in the D23 extended footage that we saw in the PSX featurette, where Spider-Man dive bombs, he swings, he runs across a wall, he zips across the building, and then he goes back into web swing. That's exactly how the traversal is going to work, with fast-paced, stylish momentum, and I can't wait to see how more of the traversal will work in the final game. Now we're getting into the main featurette that we did get from Insomniac Games at PSX in regards to new information, which they stated in that video, in which John Paquette, the lead writer of the game, is actually going into detail about Martin Lee and Aunt May's relationship with each other. John goes into saying when Peter Parker is out being Spider-Man or when he's out working, Martin Lee is actually the one who is taking care of Aunt May when she's at the feast shelter. And if there's a point in the game where Martin Lee finds out that Peter Parker is Spider-Man and also knows that Aunt May is Peter's aunt, that might be actually really intense to see if Martin Lee may take her hostage as Mr. Negative. This leads into the next piece of really interesting information given at PSX from the behind-the-scenes featurette, is where Brian Intar talks about Mr. Negative and how something is trying to consume Martin Lee. And that goes back to the point that I made in another video where we see a close-up of Martin Lee right here turning into Mr. Negative, and he actually looks pretty upset. It almost looks like he doesn't want to turn into Mr. Negative. Given like that whole Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde complex that we were talking about in another video, it seems like he really has that going with him in this game, and I can't wait to see how it's actually handled in the story. Another point which Brian brought up in the behind the scenes video is actually when talking about Mr. Negative and the weapons that he and the Inner Demons will use in the game. So what we've seen so far is actually the Inner Demons using guns in Grand Central Station, shooting out negative energy. We've also seen the Inner Demons themselves using negative energy in their fists to try and fight Spider-Man. As for Mr. Negative himself, we've seen in the demo him using his negative sword and negative blast to try and fight Spider-Man with, but also another point that Brian brings up is actually that he will use negative whips to try and fight Spider-Man with. So that's going to be really interesting to see how a negative whip can try and be used to fight Spider-Man either in the train fight or maybe another fight that they may have in the game, and I can't wait to see him use every other type of weapon imaginable to try and fight Spider-Man with. Now getting more into the story aspect of information that we got from PSX about Spider-Man PS4, everybody, is actually the writing team and who is actually part of it. So what we know already is that John Paquette is the lead writer from Insomniac Games working on Spider-Man PS4. Another writer from Insomniac Games is Ben Arfman. He is actually a very interesting writer to work on this game. As for Marvel, what we know so far is that there are actually writers from Marvel that will help co-create this story, and we have two confirmed, is Dan Slott and Christos Gage. As you know, Dan Slott is a really controversial writer of Spider-Man comic books, which I will bring up in another video, so don't worry about that, who is actually helping with the story of Spider-Man PS4, and the other writer's name is Christos Gage. Like I just said, he is actually part of the writing team for Daredevil Season 1, and he is actually going to help create this story for the game, and I'm going to describe all about them in another video, so don't have to worry about that, and I'm just really excited to see how they're going to actually take this story for Spider-Man in the game. As for the podcast that Dan Slott and Christos Gage were actually a part of, is actually when they started to talk about Mr. Negative and how Dan Slott, when he was actually brought in the early parts of development for Spider-Man PS4, is when they were talking about Mr. Negative and how in the early stages of development, Mr. Negative was originally supposed to be more tech-based. So I don't know if he's going to be used more tech-based like Shocker clearly is, but we'll just wait and see. And the last piece of information overall from the whole PSX weekend, everybody, is actually from the podcast where Dan Slott was asked a question by the host of the Marvel podcast about what is the thing that he's most excited about for the game that people can expect when they get their hands on it. And he actually answered in a really interesting way.
What is the one thing you're most excited for people to see when this game comes out that you can talk about?
The thing I most want people to see about this game is what happens after you finish it.
Oh.
Whoa.
Whoa.
All right.
That's a good one.
That is a good one.
So whether he's talking about a new game plus aspect, maybe we get to play as Miles Morales as Spider-Man, I have no idea, but the fact that something really interesting happens when we beat the game is very interesting to hear, and I can't wait to see what it actually ends up being. And that is all the information that we got at PSX, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope I covered every piece of information properly, and again, I have another video coming where I'm going to talk about the writing aspect about the game's story with Dan Slott, Christos Gage, John Paquette, and Ben Arfman, so don't worry about that. That video will come out later. But anyways, thank you so much for watching. Stay spectacular, Spidey fans. Make sure to check out the other Spidey Squad members' videos about this game. They did a great job. Peace out.